Okay, so we had our big Comprehensive Reform and Update Act, Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970, and then in 1986 we see some updates. We see some amendments that really increased the penalties for possession and sale of scheduled of drugs on the controlled substances schedules. And we also see a really interesting change in the way that we handle sentencing for various forms of cocaine. We'll talk more about that during our cocaine unit. And then in 1998, we start to see some changes in that don't apply to the actual drugs themselves, but to what we call the precursors. And if you look at the item that the gentleman in the picture of the right was holding before 1998, you were definitely able to purchase that. Now it's considered paraphernalia, and possession of drug paraphernalia can also be illegal. And what is paraphernalia and what is not is established by our new Office of National Drug Control Policy. Okay, so we talked a little bit about prison population and the conflict between state and local regulations. This between state and federal regulations, but we also have conflicts between state and local legislations because many of the penalties for drug manufacturing, sale, use, and possession are actually mandated at the state level. We see a lot of variety from state to state. Now, if there is a federal law in place for that particular substance, then that federal law is going to override whatever the state law is. And if you look at the chart at the bottom of the slide, we're looking at the number of prisoners per 1,000 population here in the United States. You see that really dramatic jump between 1985, starting in 1985 and continuing throughout the rest of the chart. It's where we see this societal trend we call the war on drugs beginning. So we start to see a much higher incarceration rate. And a lot of this has to do with changes in the way that we handled sentencing for drug convictions. There's lots of different opinions on the appropriateness and effectiveness of these changes, but the consequences they're just inescapable. At the end of this, we've ended up with the greatest proportion of our citizens in prison compared to any other country in the world. So we talked about federal legislation for legal drugs, federal legislation for illegal drugs, and then we're just going to talk quickly about federal requirements for drug screening. So this is when we test people for drugs. There are populations here in the United States that are subject to mandatory drug testing. These include military and federal employees. We may have some regulations in place at private companies. This can be important to be aware of if you are talking about those conflicts between state and federal law. If you are in a state where medical or recreational use of marijuana is legal, you may still work for an employer that considers a positive marijuana test grounds for dismissal, and because of the state of the federal law, that's definitely a viable option for them. So we're in an interesting state, especially with that particular drug, when we talk about what happens after those drug testing results. Of course, if it's a private company, they can make their own rules. Military and federal employees are subject to federal rules. So when we talk about drug testing, we've got lots of different issues, and they're the same ones that we face anytime that we do a test. We've got different ways to test for the same substance, and those tests may yield different results. And we've also got different levels of sensitivity for different tests. Let's say that the subject of the test smoked marijuana 30 days ago. There may be different tests that have differing abilities to detect whether or not that use occurred. So when we talk about testing, it tends to be, we tend to look at positives and negatives as conclusive information, but it's important to know that the results may vary based on the testing, the time frame, and the sensitivity of the test. All right, so we looked at one of the impacts of drug enforcement when we looked at the increased incarceration rate here in the United States through the end of the 20th century. But it's important also to consider the amount of money that goes into drug enforcement. In 1980, we were already spending $1 billion on drug enforcement. In 2013, we were up to over $25 billion, so that's billion with a B, a very substantial proportion of our federal budget. And it's not just here in the United States. The DEA goes abroad to over 40 countries. And we talked about that conflict between federal and state legislation, but we also may have conflicts between different kinds of national legislation. Amsterdam has a reputation, of course, for its lack of regulation on drug use, and there's we're continuing to see changes there as well. Uruguay, for example, recently legalized marijuana. The United Nations continues to take the approach that these efforts towards legalization are an area of concern, but it's definitely going to be something interesting to keep an eye on. And of course, it's not just the DEA that's affected by affected by or contributes to the cost of drug enforcement. We also see other federal agencies such as the FAA and even the National Park Service that become involved in these enforcement activities. So $25 billion is a very high price tag, but it's not the only cost of our current approach to drug enforcement here in the United States. Just in terms of dollars, that increased prison population needs to be housed, maintained, and cared for, so there's definitely a cost that goes with that as well. We've got that loss of individual freedom as a social cost. It does cause conflict in our international policy with other countries sometimes. And then we also see the commission of crimes for individuals who are interested in purchasing drugs and looking to acquire funds to do that. So all these costs, the extremely high financial price tag, the other social costs, even the international relations costs, have been almost entirely ineffective. We have not been able to eliminate drug use here in the United States with the approach that we've been pursuing with its roots in the 20th century. So in terms of what we are able to do when we talk about the drug enforcement process here in the United States, how effective we actually are. It's difficult to say for sure. Obviously, if the drugs are being manufactured or imported illegally, they don't report the quantity that they're manufacturing or importing to the federal government so that we can figure out how much we're intercepting. But folks who specialize in this suggest that we are currently seizing approximately 10 to 15% of the illegal drug supply in the United States. There are some basic market consequences for this behavior. When we make the drug illicit, we restrict the supply. If the demand doesn't go anywhere, then the price goes up. And we increase the amount of money and thus the amount of power involved in the transaction, even though it remains illegal. So definitely some consequences to consider there. And if you hear people discuss legalization, that's one of the goals of that effort, is to reduce the amount of money and power involved in the transactions by making by removing the restrictions on the legality of the substance. And then another thing to consider is whether those drug laws actually keep people from becoming users. And it's one that we don't really know the answer to. We don't really know whether people who don't become dependent, don't use, were never going to in the first place, or whether the presence of those laws has made a difference. So lots of interesting questions that we'll continue to discuss throughout the semester. To wrap up for Chapter 3, remember that we covered reformist attitudes and their effects on the U.S. drug regulation history. We talked through the major purposes and influence that led to the current set of federal drug policies that we have, and again, how that history affected controls on specific drugs like opioids, cocaine, marijuana, and again, how all that also comes together into our controlled substance schedules 1 through 5. And again, the impact of mandatory minimum sentencing. We talked a bit about major types of drug testing, and then the impact of our drug control efforts on our federal budget, on our relations with other countries, and its impact on our criminal justice system. Keep in mind that you should be checking in on Web Campus for due dates for Learn Smart activities and discussion questions. And of course, please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again next time.